One of the questions that we need to ask is how should we engage in the current racial conversation that's going on in our country? And I've put off for a while doing a video on this for a couple of reasons. One is that it is just such an emotionally charged subject. And it just seems like there's new things that are happening every day that are changing the way it's talked about and who's talking about it. And I want to try to avoid just simply reacting to an event or giving an emotional appeal, but rather to think about how do we speak into the larger context that we find ourselves facing right now. The second reason that I've sort of put this off is that there are a lot of voices already out there that are already speaking into this issue. Some of which have really articulated very clearly views that I would agree with. And so I've been trying to figure out how do I bring something and put something together that will add to the conversation something new instead of just being a parrot of what's already out there and what others are already saying. For me, that's a little bit easier to do than maybe some people, because several years ago I made the decision to opt out of following sort of the daily news cycle. I don't own a TV. I don't get my news from a single source. And as a result, I get to watch both sides as they sort of set up straw men of their opponents and then tear them down and never actually engage in meaningful conversation with one another. In fact, I'm convinced that the competition for ratings has caused the media in this country to be completely disinterested in helping to resolve our issues. And social media is worse. It just thrives on the outrage that everybody has and giving everybody a platform to just vent whatever they're feeling. And it's a little bit disheartening that many of the platforms and the infrastructure that we have that really could be used to help bring people together and help us to seek solutions to some of the issues that we have in this country instead are being used to continually divide us. And if you're like me and you've tried to listen to both sides and watch what's happening on all sides, particularly of the racial conversation in this country, you've probably gotten kind of frustrated seeing some of the same things I have. Now, like all of us, I am not an impartial observer. I watch and listen and process information through my own grid of values and perspective. And some people will argue that that just invalidates or skews my assessment of the situation. But I don't think that's actually the case. Because I think if we're actually going to address the issues of race in this country, we don't need to approach it in isolation to all other issues. At the same time, we need to make sure that we don't make it the only lens through which we understand everything else in the world. Because either way you go on this, if you try to isolate it, or if you make it the lens through which you view everything, it is going to actually cause you to have bias. And what's going to happen is that you're going to argue that it's the other side that's biased and doesn't know it when you're intentionally sort of not seeing your own vantage point. I think instead of taking either of those perspectives, we need to just have a comprehensive view of the world that allows us to process all of the facets, all of the facts about this issue in a way that's going to help us move towards resolution rather than just increasing division and forcing us to keep in our own little silos. Okay, so in this discussion of racism, where do we start? Well, I think we need to start with the phrase Black Lives Matter. We've got to start here. This is the slogan, the phrase that has been driving the current conversation. And one of the things that I think is helpful in engaging in conversations, I've found, is that you almost need to ask the person you're talking to what they mean by that statement. And it might seem like a strange place to start. What do you mean by Black Lives Matter? But this one phrase gets used by a whole lot of different people in a whole lot of different ways. Many people who use this phrase have an agenda that they're trying to drive forward. And a lot of times what you find out is that that agenda has very little to do with the value of Black lives. So let's start by simply looking at this phrase, right? It's a pretty simple phrase, and it seems like there are implied at least two things just in the statement, Black Lives Matter. The first thing that's clearly implied is that Black lives matter as much as any other life. Now, look, the phrase itself does not imply that Black lives matter more than any other life, nor that Black lives matter, well, a little bit, but no, Black lives matter as much as anyone else. Black lives have the same value as any other life. Now, that might seem like a simple, basic thing, but it's important because how many times have we seen somebody say, Black lives matter, and then there's this response from the other side, no, all lives matter. To which then back to the other side, it says, well, no, all lives won't matter until all Black lives matter. And then somewhere somebody makes this crazy statement that blue lives matter. Wait, when did the police become a race of people? Or are you arguing that Smurfs are real and have value? Either way, you've just gone completely off the reservation. Look, we can come back to a discussion about the police later in the video, but look, we've got to get beyond just shouting slogans at one another and thinking that this is going to lead to any kind of meaningful dialogue. The phrase Black Lives Matter implies that Black lives matter as much as any other life. And so let's just start there. There's a second thing that is implied by this phrase that we need to understand, and that is using the phrase implies that it's needed. Let me explain. If I told you that my shirt is gray, well, that would be a true statement, but it really wouldn't add anything to our conversation. But it's a valueless statement. It didn't tell you anything you didn't already know. Now, if I were teaching a small child to understand color, the fact that so many people are using the phrase Black Lives Matter tells us that there is at least a perception that there are many people engaged in the discussion that either don't know or don't accept this to be true. Now, whether you believe that this perception is accurate or not, if we're going to engage in a conversation, we need to acknowledge that there are a lot of people who believe that there are a lot of other people who don't believe that Black lives have the same value as every other life. Now, as a Christian, I need to stop here at this point and ask an important question. What does the Bible have to say about race? Does the Bible tell us that Black lives matter? Does the Bible tell us that Black lives matter as much as any other life? Well, believe it or not, the Bible gives us a very clear answer to the question. And we find it in the very first chapter of Genesis. God said, let us make man in our image, after our likeness, and let them have dominion over the fish of the sea and over the birds of the heavens and over the livestock and over all the earth and over every creeping thing that creeps on the earth. So God created man in his own image. In the image of God, he created him. Male and female, he created him. The Bible tells us that God created man in his own image, all mankind. All mankind is created in the image of God. It doesn't say God created black man and white man, but rather it says that God created man. And if you accept the Bible's account of God's creation of man, whether you want to read it as a literal historical account, as I would, or if you want to say, well, it's sort of an allegorical thing that's there to teach us a lesson, either way, you have to come to the same conclusion. The Bible gives all people equal value before God. And because all of us, it tells us, are created in the image of God. Now, if you're a little less familiar with the Bible, you might be a little confused here. You might have been told that the Bible supports slavery or even teaches that black people are cursed by God. These things are untrue. The Bible does contain documents which describe slavery and acknowledges the existence of slaves in various cultures. But it does not promote one race of people above another. In fact, most often when referring to slaves in ancient Israel, it's referring to fellow Israelites who sold themselves into slavery because of their financial situation. And when read in their context, the ancient Jewish law actually gives protection to slaves and gives them a path to regain their liberty. So while we're on the subject of slavery, I think it's a true statement that in order to have a conversation about race in America, we must acknowledge the history of slavery and oppression that was faced by Black people in America. When you read accounts of the African slave markets, we see people being treated as animals. They are bought, they are sold, they are held as property, and they're viewed really as a second class race of people. Now, note I say a second class race of people, not less than human. A lot of people in the recent conversation want to look back and pull up the Three-Fifths Compromise of 1787 and try to argue that, well, white people in America used to see Black people as being less than human, and maybe they still do today. But, in fact, the Three-Fifths Compromise actually shows that the Founding Fathers did recognize slaves as people. The conundrum they found themselves facing was the question of whether or not a state who has a population of people who at that time were not allowed to vote should be able to count those people towards their population for purposes of representation in Congress. Now remember that especially prior to the Civil War, but even today, representatives in Congress don't represent you. They represent the state that they are from. And so the Three-Fifths Compromise was actually just a procedural decision that had nothing to do with evaluating the value or worth of the person. And so don't misrepresent what they did legally in order to figure out representation and then sort of say, well, that has to do with how people were viewed in terms of their value as a person. Another sort of sad reality is that America didn't invent racial slavery. The African slave trade in Europe predates America by hundreds of years. And the reality is that throughout history, we see accounts of one people group enslaving another for various reasons. Part of the evil in the heart of man is our desire to exalt ourselves and our people above all others. And this manifests itself in every culture, in every place throughout history. It might look different at different times, but it's there, and it needs to be fought against. We'll return to sort of some more issues related to history, but first, let's come back to where we are today. We've been talking about Black Lives Matter. The reality is that that statement is more than a slogan or phrase. It's also the name of an organization. Now, there are many who have gone to great lengths to try to characterize or usually mischaracterize what this organization stands for. Some people seek to demonstrate the great good that it's done and how needed it is in our society today. Other people just brand it a terrorist organization. But what if, rather than making claims about the organization called Black Lives Matter, we actually look at what they have to say about themselves? Recently I had someone ask me, well, shouldn't Christians support Black Lives Matter? They were confused because on one hand, they support this idea that all people have equal value before God. But yet many Christians are opposed to Black Lives Matter. So how do we reconcile this? Well, we need to start by asking, well, what is the organization BLM, Black Lives Matter, all about? And I think we need to, in having that discussion, we need to stop re-quoting all the things that you've heard from other people about BLM. And I would say that on both sides, whether you're pro or against, get rid of all the things that people are telling you and actually go to their own website, because if you do that, they have a wealth of information on their history, on who they are, on what they believe. And so you don't need to guess at it. They tell you straight up front, here's who we are, here's what we're all about. And there's a lot there. There's a lot of material. So I'm going to do my best here to give you a one-sentence summary of who they are. And I invite you to listen to what I have to say and then go to their website and see if what I'm saying matches with what you find there. Because I've done my best. Everything I'm about to share with you, I am pulling directly from their website of who they say they are. Black Lives Matter is an American political organization that intentionally embraces and elevates transgendered persons, which is seeking to bring about international societal change, which will liberate all Black people from anything which would inhibit their social, economic, or political advancement while removing all patriarchal, male centered structures in the family and culture. Let me give you that sentence again. Black Lives Matter is an American political organization that intentionally embraces and elevates transgendered persons, which is seeking to bring about international societal change that will liberate all Black people from anything which would inhibit their social, economic, or political advancement while removing all patriarchal, male centered structures in the family and culture. Now, notice within that statement, I put no value judgment on it at all. It's simply a summary, as far as I can understand it, of what BLM themselves claim that they are all about. So now let's just ask the question, how might you engage with this organization? Well, first we need to understand what it is, right? It is a political action organization. It is an organization with a politically motivated agenda, particularly here in America. The primary goal is to impact public policy towards its goals and objectives. Now, that's not a bad thing. It is good to be engaged in the political process and to have some goals and objectives and to seek to bring public policy in that direction. There's nothing wrong with that. That's the way our system works. But I want you to notice, too, in that it doesn't have anything to do with promoting the value of Black lives. In fact, when you look at who they are and what they're all about, you're going to find a high value placed on elevating transgender and other non-heterosexual individuals. That's their phrase, non-heterosexual. Now, for Bible-believing Christians and for many others, this becomes problematic. Maybe not for the reasons you'd expect. You see, just as the Bible does not give us a race category for identifying people, it also does not give us sexual identity or preference as a way of identifying people. In fact, in the same verses we just looked at regarding the creation of man, the Bible only identifies two types of people. God, who created us, only gives us two, male and female. Now, what this means is that any other categories that we come up with, black or white, straight or gay, royal or peasant, white collar or blue collar, none of these are categories that are given by God to define who we are. There's only one, male and female. And so anything that is beyond this is a societal construct not tied to our biology, not tied to our true identity, not tied to our worth as a person. The Bible describes our sexuality, how we practice that, as something we do, not something that we are. And so for a Christian, I have a hard time supporting an organization that promotes identifying people in ways that the Bible does not. And so the fact that BLM says, look, we place a high value on transgender, which actually is one of the few categories that the Bible would specifically rule out when it says male and female, that's a little problematic for me. There's another concept that we find throughout Black Lives Matter stuff, and that is the idea of liberty. Now, here's an area where BLM and I can come together almost. Because if you know me, you know I can talk all day about the value of freedom. You've probably heard me say this many times. Look, I would consider myself at this point to be a libertarian. And it's because I believe that freedom is good for people. I believe in small government. I believe in states' rights. I believe everyone should be able to live freely. You know, our Constitution promotes freedom and liberty for all people. Now, I know it hasn't always been realized, but the value is there. political liberty, freedom from state oppression. Man, but that isn't exactly entirely what BLM has in mind when they talk about liberty. Because BLM rightly recognizes that the factors that hold people in bondage, the factors that prevent them from achieving their potential, are not always limited to public policy. Now, let's pause here for a second and return to American history. Throughout our history, whether we want to go all the way back to the slavery era, whether we want to look at the Jim Crow laws of the South, whether we want to talk about redlining or other public policies or practices that sort of created the impoverished inner city neighborhoods that we have today, there's been a lot of laws, there's been a lot of public policies in the past that has disproportionately disenfranchised Black people. And fortunately, thanks to the civil rights movement of the past generation, many of these things have been addressed. And today, the claim that there is institutionalized anti-Black racism is largely overstated. There are not separate rules for Black people and white people in our society. The reality is we have leveled that playing field. Now, unfortunately, we do have some other issues that we need to address. We do have a poverty problem in America. We do have a wealth disparity that has created some very different classes of people. And yes, a disproportionate number of the poorest among us are Black, and that is largely due to our history. But the thing about poverty is that it affects you the same regardless of your skin tone. We do have a drug problem in America, and we have a disproportionate number of Black people that are incarcerated on drug-related offenses. That has to do with sentencing looking different, and I think largely due to economics more than race. But illegal drug use and sales, guess what? They affect all people regardless of their race. And so to say that these things are caused by racism, I think, is to undercut a meaningful conversation about how we might actually address and resolve them. There are at least two problems with the way Black Lives Matter wants to approach these issues. The first is that in their quest to help Black people to overcome the things which are inhibiting them from improving socially, economically, and politically, they're assuming that all of these things are put onto the Black community from outside of it. In doing so, it's now an us against them, rather than being able to say, look, we as a nation, we as a community, we need to pull together. We need to address the fact that there is poverty in our neighborhoods. We need to address the fact that there are cities that have impoverished areas. We need to do that together, collectively, and say, how do we solve this issue? The second problem that I see with BLM and the way they address these issues is that by specifically seeking liberty for only one group of people, specifically Black people, they imply that if it really does come down to it, it actually might be okay to oppress or to take away some of the rights of other people if it benefits Black people. And in fact, some people, didn't see this on the BLM website, but some people would even argue that it's just because, well, Black people suffered for a lot of years without rights, and so now it's your turn to suffer and not have rights. That's ridiculous, right? A final issue that many Christians have with Black Lives Matter is this statement, and I take this from their own website. Quote, "We disrupt the Western prescribed nuclear family structure." And later there's a place where it lists something that lists mothers, parents, and children. Note that it specifically leaves out fathers in that statement, right? And in another place, they clearly state this. It says, quote, "We dismantle patriarchal practices." The Bible from beginning to end places a value on male leadership. And not in a way that denigrates women or even excludes women. In fact, the Bible and its influence in Western society has done more to liberate women than anything else ever has. Look, I don't need to prove this to you. I can just simply point you to take a look at Sharia law. Take a look at the treatment of women in Middle Eastern countries or in other male dominant Eastern cultures in Asia. Man, there is no comparison, right? It has been the biblical influence on Western culture that has liberated women in huge ways. As a Christian, it's hard for me to get behind an organization that, as part of its stated goals, is to dismantle male centered structures. Because really, what they're saying is that they want to devalue the role of men in society and in the family. And many Christians are going to have a really hard time getting behind an organization that has that as one of its stated goals. Moving beyond Black Lives Matter, the phrase and the organization, we need to look at some of the specific actions that have taken place in recent days. Now, I know this might seem like old news, but I think we need to start by looking at what happened in Minneapolis with George Floyd. Now, I know there have been other instances like this before and since, but by now everyone has seen this video. So let me ask you the question. What did you see in that video? Did you see racism? Let me tell you what I saw. I watched a man get murdered. And actually, worse than that, I watched a man be murdered by someone who had sworn an oath to serve and protect the community. Now, what should happen in this instance? Well, we have a legal system. And in our system, police are not above the law. And we need to demand and expect that our legal system will work. Now, no one is saying that our system is perfect. There are cases where justice does not happen, either because there's legal loopholes or because of corruption. And wherever we see loopholes and corruption, we ought to work to root those things out. But here's what should not happen as a result of that. People should not be taking to the streets rioting. Stores should not be attacked and looted. Businesses and property being set on fire. This should not happen. These tactics do a good job of demonstrating that people are angry, but they actually hurt the cause of justice. It is unjust to cause civil unrest in your community because of a perceived wrong. Now, I've had some conversations with people who will say to me, well, we have to do this because it's the only way we can get people to notice us. I'm not convinced that's true. There are a lot of ways that in the past people have disrupted the system without causing harm to the people around them. And is this really what you want to be known for? For myself as a Christian, and I suspect for many others, look, I'm happy to get behind a cause that wants to seek equality for all people under the law. But I'm not going to get behind a movement that uses terrorist-like tactics to try to push to get their way. What do I mean by that? Well, while we're talking about terrorist-like actions, let's take a look at another phenomena that has cropped up recently that honestly makes absolutely no sense to me. The removal of public displays of statues and public figures. I noticed online the National Review has been keeping a cancel culture list of statues that have been removed, of people that have been silenced by mob action or removed by officials who have caved to pressure without proper procedure. There's currently 91 entries on their list. You can Google it. There are also some that are going to argue that, well, Confederate symbols and statues of Confederate generals are offensive to some communities. Well, I'm not personally offended by these. I can appreciate the reasons that some people may find them offensive, especially if they're placed on public property. But I guarantee that in every community in this country, there is already a process whereby memorials, statues, symbols on public property, whether they are on federal, state, or local land, can be removed. Petitions can be made, councils can evaluate the value of these things, and if they're deemed offensive to the community, I guarantee they will be moved or they will be removed. But there are a few problems with what's happening now. One is that we're seeing mobs that are just simply wandering the streets and seeking to vandalize, remove, and destroy public property. Yeah, I've seen this. People compare this to the removal of the Berlin Wall, to the toppling of the Saddam Hussein statue in Baghdad, or even to Moses tearing down the golden calf that the Israelites had made. You know what? None of these are historically equivalent, and I think the reasons for that are obvious. Another problem is that those who use this sort of Confederate generals are offensive argument are either ignorant of what's happening or intentionally seeking to mislead people and draw their attention away from what is actually happening. You know, Wikipedia actually now has a page, and this is the title of the Wikipedia page is, quote, list of monuments and memorials removed during the George Floyd protests, unquote. When you go down that list, and there's more than 200 items on that page, less than half have anything to do with the Confederacy. In addition, statues are being torn down or pressure is being placed for their removal by people from outside the community where the statue is located. Chicago, for instance, recently gave into pressure and removed temporarily 2 statues of Christopher Columbus. Now, however you feel about Columbus, that's irrelevant. They were removed out of concerns for public safety to cause the mobs to stop attacking the statues and people and the police who were sent to protect public property. Now, one of these statues was removed from a primarily Italian neighborhood where the local residents, far from being offended by the statue, actually valued the statue as part of their heritage. But due to pressure from those outside the community, their statue had to be removed. And in addition to public monuments, statues and depictions located on private property are also being vandalized and destroyed. One example is a Catholic church in Miami, where a statue of Jesus was toppled and beheaded. Now, I understand there are those that find Jesus offensive, but quite honestly, seeing you topple and behead Jesus is offensive to me. There are many who are calling on other churches to remove stained glass windows or other depictions of Jesus. You know, where does this end? And the problems here are obvious. You know, there's another recent phenomenon when we get into this discussion of racism, and it's this idea of setting up these autonomous zones, right? Now, look, in concept, there is a part of me that wants to be able to support this. I understand the spirit behind a quest for freedom and seeking greater local autonomy, but these zones are not being set up in a quest for greater freedom from oppression. Rather, they're militant takeovers of neighborhoods. And as much of a contradiction as it may seem, our freedom and our safety comes from the fact that we have rule of law. When gangs and militant organizations seek to claim territory by force, they really are by definition committing treason against their community, against the state, and against the federal government. And quite honestly, I think they ought to be treated as such. There are plenty of examples in our country of communes, of communities that operate within our country legally, where the residents of that community are able to live freely in a manner that might be countercultural or seem weird to people, but it aligns with their religious beliefs or whatever it is that they have that binds them together. And these get set up legally and peacefully, and community members have chosen to move into these by their own choice. This is not what's going on with these current sort of autonomous zones that are being set up at all. You know, these autonomous zones are often connected to another movement that's gaining traction in our society right now. And that movement, you know, sort of has this slogan of defund the police, right? Defund the police. Okay, as we look at that, okay, it really doesn't mean get rid of the police force, you know, and all those things. We'll put that aside for now. But look, I get it. we've seen a lot of examples in recent years of police brutality. The ones that make the headlines are usually the white on black crimes, but unfortunately, there's a lot of examples of white on white, black on black, and every other nationality and combination of police brutality cases that we can observe. Um, but how should we address these? Well, I think first we need to recognize that blue is not a race of people. Being a police officer is a job that people choose to do. You do not lose your identity, your background, your ethnicity when you become a police officer. Second, let's also recognize that we do not have a national police force. Each local municipality in this country has their own police. And so when we talk about sort of police on a national level, we're talking about an organization that doesn't exist. We don't have federal police in this country. We don't have army soldiers that are occupying our streets and enforcing some oppressive laws from up above, right? They do in a lot of places in the world. We don't in America. In fact, many police officers in this country live in the same community where they serve. They're not some foreign outside force, but they're members of the community who have chosen to accept the responsibility of serving and protecting their community and enforcing the laws that are on the books in that place. It's also really unhelpful to talk about good cops and bad cops, right? As though there's just, there's this some group of people within the police that are just evil. And really all we need to do is root out these evil people and then everything will be better. Look, if you believe that, then you would have to believe actually that all cops are evil. Because if the majority are good cops who truly desire to serve and protect their community, then certainly they would have eradicated the bad cops long ago. So if we can't blame racism, and we can't blame just some bad apples, and if there isn't some police force that's this outside oppressive force, how do we understand and address issues of police brutality? Well, first, we need to understand that police in this country are not above the law. And we need to trust and expect that when police officers commit crimes, they will face the same legal system that everyone else does. In fact, in many places, the penalties for police officers who commit crimes is higher because it's also seen as a breach of public trust or an abuse of power. Secondly, we need to address each instance individually and not see them as part of a connected whole. Look, unless we can show that a particular individual or a particular police department is repeatedly guilty, to try to connect unrelated events because they are similar and then try to build that into saying, hey, see, there's a pattern, that is just completely invalid and unhelpful. Finally, I think we need to address the fact that police officers are human. And if we're seeing high rates of police brutality, particularly in urban settings, maybe we need to start asking what is it that's common in all of these settings that might be causing this? Maybe we need to start asking what is it about the culture of these communities? What is it about the stress that these officers are under? What is it about their training, their equipment that they have available to them? What can we do to begin to look at this and say, what is it that is common in all of these situations? I recently read a couple months ago about a police department. I don't remember the city. It was one of the larger urban areas in our country that internally a few years ago did a study into the claims that they had been receiving, the complaints about police brutality within their own department. As a result of their investigation, they implemented a training program for their officers, and they began to change the culture of the police to emphasize the goal of de-escalate rather than the goal of dominate in any given situation. And they have seen charges of police brutality drop by a third in only a few years' time. To me, look, this is good evidence of what happens when people actually look at the issue and try to seek to find solutions so that we can overcome them. Look, we have a poverty problem in this country. We have a wealth disparity that is causing problems in our country. I believe we can overcome that. I believe we can overcome police brutality. I believe we can even find an appropriate way for communities to express themselves through depictions of appropriate historical figures. But when we immediately put all of these things under the label of racism, we immediately shut down any meaningful conversation. We end up causing the very racism that we're trying to fight against. You know, the civil rights leaders of the 1960s imagined a day when we'd be able to have conversations like these that didn't focus around race, but rather where we could come together and see the good, seek the good of our community rather than dividing it. And so I guess I'd ask you, you know, wherever you are on the spectrum, maybe you're a BLM supporter, maybe you're out waving a flag that says back the blue. Throw out your signs. Stop doing your rallies. Let's move away from slogans and shouting at one another. And let's actually begin to have a conversation about the real issues that are going on in our country, and maybe talk about those in a way to say, okay, how can we work to resolve those issues rather than just how can we yell our side a little bit louder than the other side. So that's my hope that maybe you'll be encouraged to do that.